She was 18 years old, and she was broke in the way that is absolute. Not the temporary broke of a bad week, not the recoverable broke of a missed shift, but the kind where the number in the account is a number you check once and then stop checking, because checking it again produces the same number and produces it faster. She had a backpack from 7th grade with a keychain on the zipper that she'd never removed because removing it at some point had stopped seeming important. A pair of work boots she'd bought at a yard sale for $3, and a single dollar bill she had folded into the small front pocket of her jeans and carried there since April, when she had found it under the seat of the bus on the way to the job that turned out not to last, and had kept it on the reasonable theory that finding a dollar and spending it immediately was a way of not having found it. And with that dollar, Petra Moss bought a stone springhouse on 2 acres of Pennsylvania Creek bottom outside a town called Vanner's Mill that the Lancaster County Land Office had been carrying on its surplus list since 2011. A structure built in 1879 from local limestone, set into the hillside above a spring that had not stopped running in the recorded history of the property, which was considerable, and which the county's own file described as continuous since at least 1831. The Springhouse had not been used since the 1960s, when the farm it belonged to was subdivided, and the Springhouse ended up on a sliver of land that was neither large enough to farm nor situated well enough to build on, and had therefore been passed around among county records for 30 years before anyone thought to offer it for $1. Everyone who drove the back road past Vanner's Mill and noticed the old Haas Springhouse, and not many people drove it, because it was a back road in the way that some back roads are genuinely back, not scenic back but forgotten back, said what people say about old stone buildings that have been left to themselves for 60 years, which is that it was a shame, and that the stone was probably still good, and that somebody ought to do something. Nobody had done something, but what none of them knew, and what there was no occasion for anyone to know, was that inside the cistern at the center of the Springhouse floor, the stone-lined storage basin, where spring water had once been held cold and clear for the farm's dairy and household use, beneath 14 inches of accumulated silt and leaf mold in 60 years of slow infill. Sealed inside a lead-lined oak box that had been placed there by a woman named Clara Haas in the spring of 1963, before the farm was subdivided and the Springhouse ceased to be anyone's specific responsibility, was something Clara had spent the preceding 30 years of her life accumulating with the patience and precision of someone who understood that the best things she would ever do were the things she did for people she would never meet. Something that would change Petra Moss's life from a number she had stopped checking to something she could not have imagined when she found the dollar under the bus seat in April. And something that would mean, for the people who had told Petra, directly or by implication, in words, or in the specific silence that is louder than words, that she was not going to amount to much, that they had been operating on incomplete information. If this kind of story finds you, a story about what is waiting in the places everyone else stopped looking, we'd love it if you'd subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And in the comments, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every one. Petra Moss had grown up in Vanner's Mill, in a rented house 3 blocks from the grain elevator. Her mother, Linda Moss, worked 2 jobs for most of Petra's childhood: days at the hardware store, evenings cleaning offices in Lancaster, and had the tiredness of someone running on the minimum required to keep things going for so long that the minimum has become the baseline. She was not neglectful. She was stretched in the way that makes neglect and presence look similar from the outside when they are very different from the inside, and Petra understood the difference and did not hold the stretching against her. What she held instead was the competence her mother had developed under pressure, the ability to fix things with what was available, the refusal to complain about conditions she couldn't change. These were things worth holding, Her father was a person Petra had met twice. The second time, when she was 11, he had bought her a soda at a gas station and been pleasant in the way of someone performing pleasantness. And she had understood that his presence or absence was not a variable she could influence, and had decided, with the pragmatic clarity that some 11-year-olds develop when they have no choice, to stop spending energy on it. She had done well in school in the invisible way, not the way that produces awards, but the way that produces a person who knows things because she went looking for them. She knew the native plants of every road in Lancaster County. She knew the history of the county's agricultural drainage systems. She knew how springs worked, the geology, the hydrology, the way the water table expresses itself through landscapes, because she had found a book about it in 9th grade, and it had led to 2 more, which was how Petra's education worked. She had been accepted to a state university on the strength of a recommendation from her science teacher, Miss Albrecht, who told her to her face that it was deserved. She had not been able to go. The finances did not close, and the debt load required to bridge the gap would take a decade to service. And she had made this calculation at 17 with the same methodical pragmatism she had applied to the question of her father at 11. She had graduated high school, gotten a job at a nursery in Lancaster, been laid off in October when seasonal business dropped, a second job at a diner in Vanner's Mill, lost in February when new ownership brought in family, a third job at a distribution center east of town, lasting until July when the contract was moved to a different facility and 22 people, including Petra, were let go on a Friday with 2 weeks severance and the particular corporate regret stated in the passive voice. She was 18 years old and she had $79 in the account and $1 in her pocket and a backpack from 7th grade, and she was sitting on the steps of the rented house where her mother still lived, in the July heat, trying to decide what the next thing was, when a woman who lived across the street, named Mrs. Holt, came out to water her garden and called over, in the way of women who have watched a neighborhood for decades and have decided that information is a resource and resources ought to circulate, that she had heard the county land office was trying to get rid of the old Haas Springhouse for $1. Petra looked at her. "It's a stone building," Mrs. Holt said, as if this settled something, which to Petra it did. She walked to the county land office the next morning because she did not have gas money for the car, and the walk was 40 minutes, and 40 minutes was available. The land officer was a woman named Gretchen Farr, who had been in the office for 14 years and who handled the situation with the practical efficiency of someone who has been waiting for a taker and has learned not to be surprised by the form the taker takes. She found the Haas Springhouse file without hesitation and put it on the counter. 2 acres of creek bottom, Gretchen said. The Springhouse, 1879. Limestone, 1 room approximately 16 by 20 feet, set into the hillside so that the rear wall was the hillside, the spring emerging through the rear wall into the interior through a channel cut in the stone. The spring had been running continuously through that channel for as long as anyone had recorded anything about it. The cistern, stone-lined, cut into the floor of the Springhouse, approximately 6 feet by 4 feet and 3 feet deep. The water table of the spring keeping it at a near constant level historically, though the current level was unknown because the last inspection had been in 2009 and the inspector had not entered the cistern. Because inspectors do not enter cisterns, they note their existence. The roof was the issue. The original slate had held until approximately 2004, and then a section of the north side had failed, and what had been a sound enclosed space had become a partially open one, and the silt and leaf mold that had accumulated since then were the natural consequence. The walls were sound. The spring was running. Gretchen knew this because the water table in that section of the county was fed by a reliable aquifer, and the spring had not stopped in the documented history of the property. And the documented history of the property was longer than most things in Lancaster County. Petra put the dollar on the counter. Gretchen stamped the form. She looked at Petra in the way of a person who has made an assessment and is deciding whether to share it. She decided to share it. "The spring is the best thing about it," she said. "Don't lose the spring." "I won't," Petra said. She was not certain yet what she would do with the spring. She was certain she would not lose it. She walked the 40 minutes back and borrowed her mother's car for the afternoon and drove to the property. The back road to it was 8 miles from the center of Vanner's Mill, and the last quarter mile was a track rather than a road. 2 ruts through the creek-bottom grass that suggested a vehicle had once used them regularly and had not done so for some time. The Springhouse appeared around the curve of the hillside as she rounded it on foot. The car left at the road's end, and she stopped and looked at it. It was exactly what limestone buildings are. Permanent. The walls were 2 feet thick at the base, laid with the care of someone who understood that the building's job was to maintain a temperature differential between the spring-fed interior and the summer exterior, and that 2 feet of limestone would do this better than anything else available in 1879. The north section of the slate roof had failed, as Gretchen had said, but the south section was intact. The door was heavy oak, swollen in its frame, and took her shoulder to open, and the smell that came out was cold stone and water and green things growing in the dark, where moisture is constant. Inside, her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The spring channel in the rear wall was running. She could hear it before she saw it, a sound she recognized from the books. The particular quiet persistence of water that has been doing this for longer than anyone present has been alive. The channel was a cut in the limestone, perhaps 8 inches wide and 4 inches deep, and the water came through it in a sheet and fell into the cistern. The cistern. She looked at it for a long time. It was in the floor, stone-lined, the limestone courses of its walls continuing the quality of the building's exterior, dressed, careful, built to last. The current level of the water was perhaps a foot below the cistern rim. Above the waterline, she could see the accumulated silt, a dark layer perhaps 14 inches deep along the bottom, compressed over 60 years, with root material and leaf mold incorporated into it. Below the silt would be the original stone floor of the cistern. She crouched at the cistern edge and looked at the water, and then at the silt line. She thought about what 60 years of infill looked like and what was underneath 60 years of infill, and thought about the Springhouse being sealed and transferred in 1963, when the farm was subdivided, and thought about what a person might do, if she were careful and had something to keep, in the spring of 1963, before a place she had tended for 30 years became nobody's specific responsibility. She thought, something is in there. She did not have the means to find out that day. She had the dollars she had spent, and $79 in the account, and no equipment for working in a cistern, and no one to help her, and the afternoon going toward evening. She noted everything she had seen and measured the dimensions she could measure by pacing, and looked at the spring channel and the cistern and the intact south section of the roof, and she drove back to Vanner's Mill in her mother's car and made a list. The list had 2 columns. The left column was what needed to happen to make the Springhouse usable. The right column was what needed to happen to find out what, if anything, was in the cistern. The right column was shorter and could happen first. She needed a pump, a helper, and a way into the cistern that didn't involve standing in water to her waist. She found all 3 within the week. The pump she rented from an equipment place in Lancaster for $42 a day, which she paid with money borrowed from her mother, in the clear-eyed manner of a person who understands the difference between borrowing money and asking for rescue, and was doing the former. The helper was a girl from down the road named Simone, who was 17 and had a summer with nothing in it. and who came because Petra had described the project with enough specificity that Simone understood it was a real thing rather than a vague idea. The way into the cistern without standing in water turned out to be a wooden plank across the short dimension of the cistern that Petra cut from a board she found in the creek bottom brush, long since fallen from something and dried to light stability. They pumped the cistern on a Thursday in August. It took 4 hours to get the water level down to the silt, the pump running continuously, Petra and Simone taking turns watching it and talking about things that had nothing to do with cisterns, which was the right way to pass 4 hours with a pump. When the water was down to the silt, she climbed in on the plank and began working the silt from the edges, the way she had read about clearing settled sediment, from the perimeter toward the center, disturbing the least amount of material at once, giving the pump time to take the loosened particles before moving further in. Simone handed her tools. Asked questions Petra answered in full because Simone's questions were good ones. She was 40 minutes into the silt work, working toward the center from the east edge, when the spade struck something. The sound was wood. Dense, wet wood, but wood. She cleared around it with her hands, the silt cold and thick and smelling of decades, and the shape that emerged was a box. Oak, by the grain that she could feel more than see in the low light, and heavy. She worked it free from the silt on 4 sides, and then lifted, and it came up, heavier than she expected, and she got it onto the plank, and then out of the cistern, and onto the Springhouse floor. It was approximately 18 inches by 12 by 12. The exterior was coated in something. She worked at the corner with her thumbnail, and it was sheet lead wrapped around the box and sealed at every seam. The kind of protection that means someone understood that water was going to be present and planned accordingly. The lead was intact. The seams were sealed with what appeared to be pitch, dry and hard, but continuous. There was a hasp on the long side, also lead-wrapped, with a padlock of cast iron that the lead had been worked around rather than through, so that the lead protection was unbroken even at the lock point. She cut the hasp with bolt cutters she had thought to bring, because the thought of a locked box in a cistern had occurred to her as a reasonable possibility. The hasp gave, and the lead wrapper lifted away from the box lid, and the lid opened on hinges that had been sealed with wax, which she broke, and which had done their job. Inside the box, in a waterproof interior lined with oilskin that had remained dry, a bundle of papers tied with cotton tape, a small leather wallet and an envelope, addressed in a hand that was precise and schooled, the kind of handwriting produced by the Palmer method that had been standard in American classrooms in the first half of the 20th century. On the envelope, "For whoever this finds, I hope the spring is still running." Petra sat on the floor of the Springhouse in the cold air that the limestone walls and the running spring kept at 52 degrees regardless of the August heat outside, and opened the envelope. Clara Haas had been born on the farm above the Springhouse in 1901 and had lived there her entire life. She had gone to the local school through 8th grade, which was the standard in that county in that era, and had then come home to help with the farm, which was also the standard, and which she wrote about without complaint and without nostalgia, as the condition of her life rather than the definition of it. She had married a man named Walter Haas at 22. A good man, she wrote, with the brevity of someone who has thought about how to say something accurately and has determined that brevity is accuracy, and they had farmed together for 30 years. Walter had died in 1958, a farm accident, and she had continued farming for 5 more years before the decision to subdivide had been reached, which she did not elaborate on except to say that it had been a family decision and that she had understood the reasoning even when the reasoning was hard. She had spent 30 years, she wrote, doing a thing that she had not told anyone about because it was her thing and some things are simply yours. She had been reading. Not in the way of reading for entertainment or instruction, though it had been both. She had been reading in the way that is more like building, accumulating knowledge in a direction with a specific purpose. The specific purpose had taken her some years to identify. What she had identified it as, eventually, was this. She wanted to know everything she could find out about the land and the water and the natural history of the place she had lived her whole life. Because she loved it in the way that only comes from long attention, and because she had found, over 30 years of paying close attention, that most people who lived in places did not pay the kind of attention she paid, and that this was a loss, and that she could do something about the loss by writing it down. The bundle of papers, she wrote, was what she had written down. 30 years of observation and research, organized by subject. The spring and its hydrology, the aquifer that fed it, the way the water temperature varied seasonally and what that variation meant, the plants of the creek bottom, catalogued by season, with the notes she had taken on their uses, both practical and medicinal, as recorded in the sources she had found, the birds that used the property across 4 decades of her records, species by species, arrival and departure dates, the soil composition by section. Mapped by hand, the flood history of the creek, reconstructed from old records and older residents and the evidence left in the creek's banks. The history of the Springhouse itself, sourced from county records and from what she had been told by people who were older than the documents. She had been writing it for 30 years, and it ran, she said, to approximately 400 pages. She had also, she wrote, put money in the leather wallet. She said this directly and simply, in the same tone as the rest of the letter, because it was a fact, and she saw no reason to make facts into something other than what they were. She had saved across her adult life in the way that became possible when you live on a farm and grow most of your food and have no car payment and no mortgage and no habits that require spending, which is a way of saving that the people who write about saving rarely describe, because it requires a life organized around it rather than a practice added to a life organized around other things. She had invested through the Lancaster County Farm Credit Office in the instruments they offered, because she understood farm credit the way she understood farm drainage, as a system with a specific logic that rewarded patience and penalized impatience. She had not withdrawn. She had let things accumulate the way she had let her research accumulate, by consistency, and by not disturbing what was growing. She had decided to put the money in the box for the same reason she had put the research in the box, because she was leaving the place, and the place deserved to have someone come to it who needed it, and someone who needed it was more likely to be someone without much money than someone with a great deal. And someone without much money who was willing to come to a stone springhouse on a forgotten back road for $1 was exactly the kind of person the money should go to. She hoped they were someone who would use the land. She hoped they would read what she had written. She hoped the spring was still running. It is still running, Petra thought. She could hear it through the rear wall, steady and cold and continuous, as it had been running when Clara was born here in 1901, and as it had been running, the documents said, since at least 1831, and as it would be running, the aquifer geology said, for longer than was useful to contemplate. She opened the leather wallet. The investment certificates were inside, organized in the careful way of Clara's papers, chronological, clipped together. The account numbers written on the front of each in the Palmer method hand. The farm credit accounts had been consolidated and transferred twice since the 1960s, which she would find when she drove to the Lancaster Farm Credit Office the following week and sat with a loan officer named David Park, who had been there for 9 years and who had seen unusual situations before and who handled this one with a combination of verification and calm that unusual situations require. David would tell her that the accounts were valid, that the consolidations had preserved the balances and the interest accruals, and that the total current value was $122,600, which was a number Petra would write down and then check against the documents and then write down again. But that was the following week. On this Thursday afternoon in August, she opened the wallet and looked at the certificates and understood their shape if not their current value. And she looked at the bundle of papers tied with cotton tape and understood that she was holding 30 years of one person's fullest attention to one piece of ground. And she sat in the Springhouse, in the 52-degree air, with the spring running. Through the channel in the rear wall, and Simone sitting quietly on the cistern edge, because Simone was, it turned out, exactly the kind of person who knows when to be quiet. "Is it what you thought it was?" Simone asked, eventually, more. Petra said. She untied the cotton tape and opened the first page of the bundle. Clara's handwriting, the same Palmer method, consistent across 3 decades of pages. The first section was headed, "The Spring, Its Character and History." She read 3 pages and understood that she had found something more unusual than money. Money was useful, and she would use it. But a 30-year record of a spring, written by someone who had been paying close attention since 1930, was irreplaceable in the specific way of things that can be done only once, by only one person, and that become impossible the moment the person is gone. She looked at the spring channel. She thought about the aquifer and the hydrology she had been reading about since 9th grade. And she thought about Mr. Albrecht's recommendation and the university she had not been able to attend. And she thought about what 30 years of careful observation of one spring in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was worth to the people who study these things. The answer to that question took several months to develop. She went to the Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster in September, to the geology department, on the basis of a phone call she had made, and a professor she had described the documents to over the phone in enough specific detail that the professor had said, carefully, that she should come in. The professor's name was Dr. Sandra Liu, and she had been studying the groundwater systems of southeastern Pennsylvania for 16 years. And she sat in her office and read 40 pages of Clara Haas's notes, while Petra sat across from her. And when she looked up, her expression had the quality of a scientist who has found something. Dr. Liu said what Petra had was a pre-instrumental record of a spring's behavior across 3 decades of the 20th century, before the aquifer had been significantly affected by suburban development and agricultural intensification. A period for which empirical field records of this quality essentially did not exist in the regional literature. "Scientifically significant," she said. She asked if she could involve 2 other researchers. Petra said yes, with conditions. The original document stayed with the land. Any publication acknowledged Clara Haas by name and described what she had been. The research was made publicly available and not paywalled. Dr. Liu agreed to all 3 without hesitation, which told Petra something about Dr. Liu. The Springhouse roof she had fixed first, in August, because the roof before everything else is the sequence for any building. She found a slate roofer in Lancaster named Tom Birch, who drove out and looked at the failed section and said it was a day's work, and named a fair price, and did it on a Saturday. The original slate from the fallen section reusable for about half the repair, and the rest matched from a salvage yard in Chester County that Tom knew about. When the roof was closed, the Springhouse interior dried within 2 weeks, the limestone walls wicking the accumulated moisture to the outside with the efficiency of 2 feet of porous stone that has been doing exactly this for 140 years. She cleaned the cistern completely. She cleared the remaining silt, replaced a section of the stone lining on the north wall that had lost its mortar, and let the spring refill it. The water came up clear and cold, 52 degrees, as it had been coming up since before anyone currently alive had been born to observe it. She had the water tested, which cost $40 at the county extension office, and which confirmed what the aquifer geology in the spring's continuous run suggested. Clean, cold, good. She had been thinking, from the first week, about what the land could be used for. The 2 acres of creek bottom had a south-facing slope on the upper section that caught the sun from mid-morning, and the spring water was available at the surface, which were 2 conditions that interested her given what she had been reading about watercress cultivation and about the economics of specialty salad crops for the Lancaster County restaurant and market trade, which was not a small trade. She spent 3 months reading about this and talking to people who grew things, and asking Dr. Liu about the hydrology implications of diverting a portion of the spring flow into cultivation channels. And Dr. Liu said the flow was more than adequate, and the chemistry was appropriate. And Petra should talk to a woman named Greta Voss at the county extension office who knew about specialty crops. She talked to Greta Voss. Greta said watercress in running spring water at that temperature and flow rate was as close to ideal conditions as the county had to offer, that the Lancaster restaurant market was underserved for locally grown specialty grains, and that Petra should start small and demonstrate quality before scaling. The advice of someone who had watched enough small operations to know quality demonstrated is worth 10 times quality claimed. Petra started small. By the following spring, she had 3 cultivation channels running from the spring outflow, the watercress established and growing in cold running water at exactly the rate the conditions had produced before she was born. 4 restaurant accounts in Lancaster by May, a farmer's market stand in June, and by August she had more orders than 3 channels could fill and was planning 2 more. She worked in the Springhouse every day. She had fixed the door, a new oak door, hung true in the original frame, and the interior was what it had been in 1879, cold and still and smelling of water and stone. 52 degrees regardless of the season, the spring running through the rear wall channel into the cistern that was now clean and clear and doing what it had been built to do. She had set a workbench along the south wall for the preparation work, cleaning and packing the watercress for delivery, and she had set a shelf above it for books. Clara's bundle of papers was on the shelf in an archival box Dr. Liu's department had provided, because the original needed protection now that it was known to be significant. Above the box, on a nail she had put in the limestone wall with a carbide bit and a steady hand, was a photograph she had found in the County Historical Society's archive, Clara Haas, 1955, standing in front of the Springhouse door, looking at the camera with the expression of a person who is not performing anything. On the first Saturday of every month, Petra drove to the county land office and stopped at Gretchen Farr's desk and brought 2 bunches of watercress in a bag. Because Gretchen had been the first person to tell her that the spring was the best thing about the property, and Petra had not forgotten this, and because showing up with something you grew yourself on a regular basis was a way of saying something that would have been clumsy to say in words. Gretchen always put the watercress in the small vase on her desk. She never mentioned the gesture. Neither did Petra. Some things are understood by doing them. It was September, the second one, when her mother called. Linda Moss had heard about the watercress. She heard things about Petra the way she heard most things about Vanner's Mill, through the lateral channels of a small town, through Mrs. Holt across the street, and the woman at the pharmacy, and the man at the hardware store who had known the Haas farm and had opinions about it. She called on a Thursday evening when Petra was at the Springhouse doing the end-of-day preparation. The watercress going into the cooler for tomorrow's Lancaster delivery. Linda said she had heard things were going well. Petra said they were. Linda said she had heard about the cistern. Petra told her about the cistern. Linda was quiet while Petra told her, in the way that Linda had always been quiet when she was listening rather than waiting to speak, which was a distinction Petra had learned to make, and which this was the former of. When Petra finished, Linda said, "I always knew you'd find something." Petra thought about this. "You couldn't have known that," she said, without sharpness. "As a fact. Not the specific thing," Linda said, "but something. You were always the kind of person who finds things." Petra looked at the photograph of Clara on the limestone wall. She looked at the spring channel running cold and clear through the rear wall into the cistern. She thought about a woman born in 1901, who had spent 30 years writing down everything she noticed about one piece of ground, and about what it meant to love a place with a kind of love that is expressed through attention and recorded for people you will never meet. And she thought that her mother was right in the way that some people are right about things. Not precisely, not in the way that can be proven, but in the way that turns out to matter more than precision. "I found something," she said. She was 18 years old, and she was broke in the way that is absolute. That was where the story had started. On a July afternoon on the steps of a rented house in Vanner's Mill, with $79 in the account, and $1 in her pocket, and a summer that was out of options. But that was not what the story was. The story was about the spring that had been running since at least 1831, and that would still be running after everyone currently alive was gone, and about a woman who had spent 30 years paying attention to it, and writing it down, and trusting the limestone walls and the lead lining and the 60-year patience of the cistern to keep what she'd written until the right person came to find it. The story was about the right person coming to find it, and what she did with it, and how $1 spent on a stone building on a forgotten back road turns out, if you are the kind of person who finds things, to be the beginning of everything. The spring ran through the rear wall and into the cistern, cold and continuous, 52 degrees, exactly as it had run the morning Clara Haas put the box in and closed it and left, and exactly as it would run the morning after Petra was gone, and the morning after that, on into the long future that springs inhabit, which is longer than the futures of the people who tend them, and which is, if you think about it the right way, exactly the kind of thing worth spending a life paying attention to. If this story reached you tonight, if it made you think about what it means to pay close attention to something over a long time, or a moment when something you almost didn't look for turned out to be exactly what you needed, we'd love it if you subscribed and shared this with someone who needs to hear it today. And in the comments, tell us this: is there a place you know deeply? A piece of land, a neighborhood, a stretch of water that you think most people walk past without really seeing? We'd love to hear about it. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.